This is a review of chapters 1 and 2, as well as some of the foundational material that we have covered so far. One of the first things that we did in this class was read an article by Donald Pixico about ethics and responsibilities in learning about American Indian history. Pixico lays out that there's two important things to note when we're studying American Indian history. First of all, moral ethics, and then secondarily, professional responsibility. Moral ethics he defines as understanding Native American tribes as distinct cultural groups. We learned in the first couple of weeks that there are over 500 nations of Native Americans within the United States today. There could have been many more, but it's hard to estimate today because of the population decline that happened at early contact, how many tribes there actually were. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to recognize that within America, prior to contact, we have a history that was alive and well, distinct, and is important to consider as we begin to learn about American Indian history. The second thing Pixico lays out that is important for us to consider as we delve into American Indian history is that American Indian history doesn't begin, or American history that is, doesn't begin in 1492. There was a world, as I mentioned prior, that was alive and well and full of things going on, of cities, of different tribes, of different contact and conflict that was going on prior to 1492. This first couple of weeks was an attempt to introduce you to that, get a sense of what it looked like, so that you have kind of a foundation that history began prior to 1492, and there was a world in existence prior to colonizers coming over to America. So the second thing that we need to understand as historians looking at American Indian history is that when we start to look at this whole history line, we need to understand how and why American Indians participated as they did in the experience. What did that look like? Where did it come from? What sort of cultural understandings might they have had? What sort of understandings might they have relayed to other tribes as well as other nations in their interactions? So in that, one of the very important things that we need to do as historians is understand the perspective of Native Americans. So instead of just looking at historical facts, we need to understand the culture of Native Americans in order to understand how and why they reacted in certain ways. As we learned early on, Native people oftentimes did not write down their own histories. They were based in oral tradition, so many of the histories have been passed down from generation to generation. We do have recordings on different sort of drawings, and so those should also be taken into account as we start to look at history of tribal people. So one of the other things that we did in looking at tribes during the first couple of weeks is we started to learn about creation stories. Creation stories lay the foundation for each tribe and help us understand the perspective of the tribe. In looking at creation stories, what we learned is that they actually define tribes' identity. They help them understand the interactions that they're going to have with the world, how they're going to relate to the land, animals, as well as each other, as we learned in the creation stories. Those stories offer them guidance about how they're supposed to interact and what happens when they don't interact in a way that they should. So they're very informative, and they lay a foundation that helps Native people define who they are in the world, as well as the organizational structure that they have within this world. The next thing we did is we looked at cultural areas. Each one of you took a chance to look at a different cultural area and a tribe within that cultural area, further defining each tribe and understanding that tribe in terms of what that geographic region meant to the tribe, the creation story that helped form the tribe, as well as what that looked like for the tribe. So in those creation stories, it defines, as we mentioned prior, that they have a strong relationship to the land. It defines not only sacred religious sites, but it also helps them understand how they're supposed to interact with the land. So you research their economy. So for many of the tribes, it was a subsistence economy. That's how they started. It's not necessarily a trade network. However, that does differ. There were some tribes that had trade networks. The creation stories also define their social structure. Social structure is also largely defined by the economy that happens within the tribe. If it is a hunting and gathering society, oftentimes it is the men who hunt, the women who gather. If it is a society that farms and that's sedentary, we oftentimes see that the women are in charge of farming, and they are the ones with more power. Finally, we also see that the political structure of the tribe is defined by those creation stories, and that's how they interact within the tribe to get things done, as well as in order to make sure that they show the respect that they need to show to one another. So one thing as we begin our look now at American Indian history, stepping out of creation stories, cultural areas, and beginning our look at history, we want to make sure to take into account these perspectives. You can see kind of the parallel here that I've laid down in this slide. There are two very different perspectives. The first is American Indian nations. They are defined in their minds by their creation stories. That's what lays down who they are, how they got here, and how they treat one another. Whereas archaeologists say that Native Americans came over the Bering Strait. We have some recent finds stating that perhaps tribes made their way into their territory about 12,000 years ago. That is different than what Native Americans think. So it's very important as we start to delve into this history to look at perspectives, to think about what different people think, why, and to simply take those into account. So as we enter this new look at history, we are going to begin with a look at each different colonizer that came into America at this time. We have a map in our textbook that basically lays out each of the different areas where the groups came in. You can see where the Spanish, the English, and then the Russians come up into the west, over into Alaska. So each of them, as they come in, have their own perspectives that we also want to take into account. So this is really chapter 3, laying out why each of these groups come and what they're looking for, and really the outcomes of what happened when each one of them came. So in general, and we always hate to generalize, but to try to encapsulate and summarize just briefly so that you can start to wrap your mind around what happened in these early days, is people were coming over into America, or native North America, as we might say, because they were driven to find land. Others might have been driven to find religious freedom, a chance to establish a new venture. It was a place that they felt like they had an opportunity to do something they might not have had an opportunity to do where they were from. So with them comes ideas about civilization, animals, germs, plants. The outcome of what happens is that with these ideas that they bring, these ideas about civilization, they influence their interactions with the people that they meet. So native tribes who have very different ideas about how to live, and then these new settlers coming in who have very different ideas about what they want and how they're going to get it. As we can see, the bringing of the animals, germs, and plants is obviously going to change the landscape. It's going to change the things that are available to native people, and it's going to change how they're able to survive in this new landscape. So we're going to start to go through each of the groups of people who start to come to America. The first one is the Spanish. Their big goal is that they wanted to come in, and they came in with this divine idea that they had a mandate to reduce people to submission. what we see in these days, on the right-hand side, I have a picture of something called the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. This is one example of something that happens when all of these groups start to come together. In the Pueblo Revolt, what had happened is that as the Spanish came in, they told all the Pueblo people that they were under their rule, and they were either slaves of the Spanish or they were required to give tribute to the Spanish government, 10% of their crops. Well, the Pueblo people didn't like this very much, and they started to rise up. For about 150 years, they showed resistance. They showed that they didn't like this. This happened in 1598, and in 1598, when they resisted, they were put on trial, and they were shown that they were going to be put back into submission during this time. So this initial revolt didn't lead to anything. However, during this next 100 years, they started to resist a little bit more. The Spanish put on trial 47 of their shamans. They killed 3, and they publicly whipped and imprisoned many more of them. During that time, that was kind of the last straw, and a gentleman named Popé decided to rise up with other Puebloans. So at that time, he tried to unite the Pueblo people. Not all Pueblo tribes decided to participate. However, many did. So in 1680, they rose up after about 150 years of submission with the Spanish people, and they destroyed mission churches. They also were able to oust the Spanish for about a 12-year time period and were under their own self-rule. So this is one example of something that happens as a result of that initial contact. Obviously not laying out all the sides of the stories. There's a much more complex story that I haven't laid out, but this is just one example of what happens. We also during this time see the French come in. The French have a very different relationship with native people. They're interested in the fur trade. Because the fur trade is very much tied to the land, what they find is most beneficial to them is intermarriage with native women. Indians also attempt to pursue alliances with the French because they're not necessarily trying to harm them, but what they want is something that native tribes can give, which is fur. So Indian people form a very different relationship with the French during this time. However, English is yet another story, and this is one question that I really want you to focus on as we're looking through all this information. What do each of these groups, the Spanish, the French, the English, Dutch, and Swedish, want? And what do they get in the long run when they originally come in to colonize? So the English, Dutch, and the Swedish arrive on the East Coast. They are interested in farmland. They want to settle primarily for religious freedom. And early on we see that they start to learn how to farm from native tribes, but eventually there's competition for farmland. And they, in some cases, intermarry with tribes, but in other cases there's conflict and there's war because there's not enough farmland to go around for everybody. So as we enter this next kind of round of chapters, I want you to definitely think about what we've laid out as kind of a foundational piece for American Indian history, thinking about how unique the tribes are, how different the stories are, and the perspectives of each group as they start to come to the table and we start to learn about this history. Try to take into those perspectives and try to be mindful as you answer the questions of what different things were going on, the different influences, and how even within tribes, different people had different ideas and responses to the time period.